a fisherman discovered a coffin beneath the depths of the ocean. Driven by curiosity, he decided to haul the coffin to the surface and open its lid. What he saw inside left him utterly shocked. Ivan gripped the edge of his chair, his calloused hands a testament to years of hauling nets and battling the relentless waters. His gaze fell on the framed photo by the old wooden clock, showing his wife, his 5 children, and his mother-in-law, their faces brimming with smiles that now felt like distant memories. The smiles were still there when he was home, but they no longer reached their eyes, and deep down, Ivan knew why. "Maybe I've been gone too much," he muttered to himself, his voice barely audible over the rhythmic ticking of the clock. He knew the answer already. It was the same one he gave himself every time he came home to his wife's half-hearted embraces and his children's quiet, sidelong glances. The fishing industry wasn't forgiving, and the choice to work long hours wasn't a luxury. It was survival. Ivan had taken the job years ago, grateful to his childhood friend Victor for introducing him to the team. The work was grueling, with weeks spent on the lake and precious few hours at home. Back then, the promise of a steady paycheck outweighed the looming shadow of sacrifices he wasn't yet prepared to face. The captain of the boat at that time, a man known for his sharp eye and sharper tongue, had chosen Ivan over Victor when the team needed to downsize. "Ivan works like he's got fire in his veins," the captain had said. "I can't say the same for you, Victor." Those words lingered, haunting Ivan long after Victor left town, his departure steeped in silence and resentment. Years later, Ivan had risen to the rank of captain himself, but the guilt from that moment never left him. He had tried to track Victor down, but the trail was cold, leaving him with unanswered questions and a hole in his chest he couldn't fill. Now, he stood as a man stretched too thin between the demands of his job and the fraying threads of his family life. His wife, once lively and full of affection, had grown distant. Their conversations rarely ventured beyond logistics. What bills needed paying, what supplies the kids needed for school, and which of her aging mother's medications were running low. One evening, as Ivan prepared for another stretch on the lake, his wife handed him a thermos of coffee without looking at him. He reached out to touch her hand, hoping for a flicker of connection. She pulled away, her eyes fixed somewhere behind him. "I know it's hard," he said softly, "but it's for us, for the kids." She nodded, but her expression was blank. "Safe trip, Ivan. Safe trip." The words lingered like the faint scent of lavender on her sweater, a smell he hadn't noticed until recently, because he hadn't been close enough to her to notice much of anything. The drive to the dock was quiet except for the hum of the old truck. He shook his head as if to clear the doubts rattling in his mind, focusing instead on the rhythm of the lake calling him back to work. Out on the water, Ivan felt a strange sense of solace. The crew was a mix of seasoned fishermen and young men learning the ropes. They respected him, and he respected them. It was a silent bond forged over storms, successes, and the unspoken understanding that life at sea was different from life on land. The night was unusually still, the lake's surface glimmering under the pale moonlight. Ivan stood at the helm, sipping coffee from the thermos, when a sharp thud echoed against the boat's hull. The sound jarred him from his thoughts, and he set the thermos down, his eyes scanning the water. "Captain!" one of the younger crew members called out, his voice tinged with nervous excitement. "Something hit us." Ivan motioned for the men to steady themselves as he moved toward the source of the commotion. "What are we looking at?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. It's something floating out there," the crewman stammered. I think it's a box or something. Ivan grabbed the flashlight from the console and leaned over the edge. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing the outline of an object bobbing against the boat's side. It was too long and narrow to be a crate, and the realization hit him like a gust of icy wind. "It's a coffin," Ivan said, his voice low. The men exchanged uneasy glances, their expressions a mix of curiosity and unease. One of the older fishermen crossed himself, muttering a quick prayer under his breath. "Bring it aboard," Ivan commanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. The crew hesitated but ultimately obeyed, securing the strange cargo with ropes and heaving it onto the deck. The coffin landed on the deck with a hollow thud, water pooling around its edges as the crew stepped back instinctively. Ivan stood over it, his jaw set, his eyes scanning the slick, dark wood. The thing looked old, its surface weathered and scarred, like it had been adrift for years, yet something about it seemed oddly intact. The air felt colder now, though there wasn't a breeze to speak of. "What now, Cap?" one of the younger men asked, his voice thin and shaky. His hands fidgeted with the edge of his coat, betraying the nervous energy coursing through him. Ivan didn't answer right away. He crouched next to the coffin, running his hand over the wood. The grooves were smooth in some places, rough in others. It didn't look like something that belonged out here, certainly not in the middle of this vast lake. He felt the crew's eyes on him, waiting, their unease growing with every second of silence. "We open it," Ivan said finally, his voice steady but low, like he was talking to himself as much as the others. The men shifted uncomfortably. One of the older ones, a man named Royce, shook his head. "Ain't right, Cap. Whatever's in there, we ought to leave it be. Some things you just don't mess with." Ivan straightened, his gaze locking on Royce. "And what do you suggest we do? Toss it back in the water and pretend we never saw it?" Royce didn't answer, just crossed his arms and looked away, his expression grim. The younger crewmen exchanged glances but said nothing. Ivan exhaled slowly, his decision made. Whatever secrets this coffin held, they couldn't leave it unexamined. Not out here. "Help me with the lid," Ivan said, motioning to the two men nearest him. The three of them moved into position, their boots squelching against the damp deck. Ivan hooked his fingers under the edge of the lid, feeling the damp weight of the wood. "On three," he said. The others nodded, their faces pale in the dim light. 1, 2, 3. The lid creaked as it lifted, the sound cutting through the heavy silence. It wasn't easy. Whatever had sealed it was stubborn, as though it didn't want to give up its secrets. Finally, with a groan and a sudden release, the lid came free and fell to the side, revealing the contents within. For a moment, nobody moved. Ivan's breath caught in his chest as his eyes adjusted to what he was seeing. There, lying side by side in the coffin, were two children, a boy and a girl. They couldn't have been more than 10 years old. Their faces were pale, their bodies unnaturally still, as though frozen in time. "They're alive," someone whispered hoarsely, breaking the spell. Ivan knelt closer, his heart pounding. The boy's chest rose and fell faintly, and the girl's fingers twitched ever so slightly. They were breathing, but just barely. Their clothes were strange, old-fashioned, like something out of a photograph from decades ago. Ivan reached out, his hand hovering over the boy's forehead. It was cold, clammy. "Get blankets!" he barked, snapping the crew into action. The urgency in his voice cut through their shock, and they scrambled to obey. As the men fetched what they could, Ivan turned his attention back to the children. How long had they been out there? How had they survived? And why a coffin, of all things? He didn't have answers, but he knew one thing for certain. They wouldn't survive much longer without help. The crew returned with blankets, wrapping the children carefully and carrying them to the captain's cabin. Ivan followed closely, his mind racing. He could feel the weight of the mystery pressing down on him, heavier than the waterlogged coffin now abandoned on the deck. Inside the cabin, Ivan watched as the children were laid on the small cot, their frail bodies almost swallowed by the thick blankets. The girl stirred slightly, her eyelids fluttering but not opening. The boy let out a faint, shuddering breath. Ivan leaned against the edge of the small cabin table, his arms crossed, watching the children. The rhythmic hum of the engine beneath him was steady, but it felt like the world around him had tilted. The boy's breathing remained shallow, and the girl, though stirring now and then, still seemed far away in whatever dark place she'd retreated to. He took a deep breath, turning to one of the younger men standing near the door. "Bring some warm tea, something light. They're going to need it when they come around." The man nodded and hurried off. Ivan's gaze shifted back to the children. They looked so small, so fragile. He hadn't seen his own kids at that age in years. His youngest was already in high school, and yet, watching these two felt like he was looking at ghosts from some forgotten part of his life. A part he'd let slip away while he was out on the water, chasing fish and a paycheck. A knock on the frame of the cabin door pulled him from his thoughts. It was Royce, the oldest crewman, his face weathered and worn, but his eyes sharp with concern. "We really turning back, Cap?" Royce asked, though it wasn't really a question. Ivan didn't bother to look up. "We are." Royce stepped further into the cabin, his boots thudding softly on the wooden floor. "You know this haul ain't gonna cover the fuel we're burning. We came out here for a reason." Ivan straightened, his expression hardening. "We didn't come out here to let 2 kids die on my watch. I don't care about the haul." Royce sighed, his hands finding their way to his hips. "Ain't saying we leave 'em, just thinking this is strange, that's all. A coffin in the middle of the lake. Kids alive in it. It don't sit right." "You think I don't know that?" Ivan's voice was quiet, but sharp, cutting through Royce's grumbling. "You think I'm not sitting here wondering what the hell is going on? But until I have answers, I'm making sure they stay alive." Royce held his gaze for a long moment, before nodding once and stepping back out into the hall. Ivan exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples. His patience with Royce was thin, but the man wasn't wrong. None of this made sense. Not the coffin, not the children, not the faintly haunting feeling that this was just the start of something bigger. The younger crewman returned with a small cup of weak tea, his hands trembling slightly as he handed it to Ivan. "Here, Cap. You think they'll drink it?" "They will," Ivan said with more certainty than he felt. He crouched beside the cot and gently touched the boy's shoulder. "Hey, kid," he murmured. "You're safe now. Can you wake up? Just a little?" The boy didn't stir at first, but after a moment his eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glassy. Ivan held the tea close to him. "Here, just a sip. It'll help." The boy's lips parted slightly, enough for Ivan to tip a little of the warm liquid into his mouth. He swallowed weakly, his gaze drifting toward the girl next to him. Ivan noticed the shift and nodded. "She's here. She's okay. You both are." The boy's eyes closed again, but his breathing seemed a little stronger, a little steadier. Ivan sat back on his heels, relief washing over him, though it was fleeting. There were too many questions and no one to answer them. Not yet. The boat rocked gently as they made their way back to shore, the lake stretching out dark and endless around them. In the galley, the crew murmured among themselves, their voices hushed but filled with nervous energy. "You think they're runaways?" one of the younger men asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Runaways don't end up in coffins," Royce muttered. "I'm telling you, there's something off about this whole thing. Could be smuggling, could be worse." Ivan's shadow filled the doorway, cutting the conversation short. He looked at each of them in turn before speaking. "Speculating isn't helping anyone. Focus on the job. We're heading back, and that's the end of it." The men nodded, avoiding his gaze, and Ivan returned to the cabin. As the hours dragged on, he found himself sitting by the cot, keeping watch. The boy had fallen into a deeper, more restful sleep, and the girl had begun to stir more frequently, though she hadn't woken fully. When the shoreline finally came into view, the weight in Ivan's chest began to lift, but only slightly. He knew this was just the beginning. As the boat docked, he gave clear orders to the crew, ensuring the children were transported carefully and without delay. A waiting ambulance took the children away, the paramedics asking questions Ivan didn't have answers to. He stood on the dock long after they'd gone, staring at the empty space where the ambulance had been. "What now, Cap?" Royce asked quietly, stepping up beside him. Ivan didn't answer right away. His thoughts were tangled, but one thing was clear. He couldn't just walk away from this. He had to know where these children came from, why they were out there, and what story the coffin had to tell. Ivan didn't go straight home that evening. He sat in his truck in the parking lot by the docks, the engine off, his hands resting on the wheel. The sky above had turned a deep indigo, stars barely visible through the soft haze of town lights. His mind felt like that sky, dim, muddled, with thoughts flickering like distant stars he couldn't quite reach. The image of the children lingered, their pale faces and fragile bodies burned into his memory. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much larger. Yet, as much as he wanted to unravel their mystery, another knot tightened in his chest, a reminder of home and the uneasy stillness that had taken root there over the years. When he finally turned the key and drove, his hands gripped the wheel tighter than usual. The road stretched before him, familiar but now somehow foreign, like it had changed in his absence. His old truck rattled as it pulled into the driveway. The lights in the house were on, spilling a warm glow onto the porch steps. It looked the same as ever, but Ivan couldn't shake the weight pressing against his chest. He stepped inside, the door creaking softly behind him. At first, everything seemed normal. The faint smell of dinner lingered in the air, and the hum of the refrigerator filled the quiet. But then he heard it. Low murmurs coming from the living room. A man's voice, deep and smooth, followed by his wife's familiar laugh. It was the kind of laugh he hadn't heard from her in years. Ivan's boots were heavy against the floor as he moved toward the living room, each step tightening the coil of unease in his stomach. When he reached the doorway, the sight before him stopped him cold. There she was, his wife, sitting on the couch with another man. And not just any man. It was Victor, his old friend, the one he'd spent years searching for, wondering where he had gone, why he'd disappeared. Now, here he was, leaning close to her, his hand resting casually on her knee, as if it had always belonged there. For a moment, Ivan couldn't breathe. His mind raced, not with anger, but with a hollow sort of disbelief. Victor, the man he'd once trusted, and his wife, the woman he'd spent years working to provide for, they both looked so at ease, so comfortable, as if he were the stranger intruding on their lives. "Ivan," she said, her voice sharp with surprise when she finally noticed him. Her face shifted, guilt, maybe, or fear, but she didn't pull away from Victor. Victor turned, his expression unreadable. "Ivan," he said, calm and steady, as if this were nothing more than a casual reunion. "Long time, no see." Ivan stared at him, then at her. Words sat heavy on his tongue, but none of them seemed worth saying. What could he say? The betrayal was already laid bare before him, and explanations wouldn't change that. He nodded slowly, the motion almost imperceptible, and turned away. He could feel her voice chasing after him, but he didn't stop. He climbed the stairs to their bedroom, and grabbed a bag from the closet. Moving methodically, he packed what little he needed, a few shirts, his shaving kit, and the old photo of his kids he kept on the nightstand. Everything else he left behind. Back downstairs, she was waiting for him by the door, her face pale. "Ivan, wait," she said, her voice trembling now. "Let me explain." He stopped, his hand on the doorknob, and looked at her. For a moment, there was a flicker of the woman he'd married, the one who used to greet him at the door with open arms and a warm smile. But that woman was gone, replaced by someone he no longer recognized. "There's nothing to explain," he said quietly. "You've made your choice. Now I'm making mine." And with that, he left. The motel room smelled faintly of mildew and stale coffee, but Ivan barely noticed. He sat on the edge of the bed, his bag on the floor beside him, and stared at the muted television. The screen flickered with a local news report he wasn't paying attention to, his mind elsewhere. He thought about Victor, the man who had once been like a brother to him. He'd carried guilt over their falling out for years, blamed himself for taking Victor's place on the boat. And now, here he was, sitting in a cheap motel room because that same man had taken his place at home. Ivan shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. Life had a cruel sense of irony. But the betrayal, as sharp as it was, didn't cut as deep as it might have years ago. Somewhere along the way, the connection between him and his wife had frayed, worn thin by years of absence and unspoken resentment. Maybe Victor was just the final straw, the breaking point for something that had been broken for a long time. As the night stretched on, Ivan's thoughts returned to the children. Their faces were clearer in his mind now. The boy's fragile breath, the girl's faint stirring. He couldn't explain it, but there was something about them that called to him, something that felt urgent and unfinished. By morning, the bitterness of the night before had dulled. Ivan packed his bag and checked out of the motel, his mind set on what came next. He couldn't undo what had happened at home, but he could focus on the mystery of the children. Ivan parked his truck outside the hospital, the early morning light casting long shadows across the pavement. He sat for a moment, his hands resting on the steering wheel, as if grounding himself for what was to come. The air felt heavy with expectation. He wasn't sure what he would learn, but he knew it wouldn't be easy to hear. Inside, the hospital buzzed quietly with the sounds of a new day. Nurses moving between rooms, the distant hum of machinery, the murmur of conversations. Ivan approached the reception desk, his boots scuffing softly on the linoleum floor. "I'm here to check on the 2 kids brought in last night," he said, his voice low but firm. The nurse, a middle-aged woman with a kind face, looked up from her clipboard. "Ah, you must be Mr. Ivan," she said, her tone warm. "The doctor mentioned you'd be coming by. They're stable now, just a little weak. Room 214. Go ahead." Ivan nodded his thanks and made his way down the hall, his steps slowing as he neared the door. He paused for a moment outside, taking a steadying breath, then pushed it open. The room was small but clean, a single window letting in soft, filtered light. The children were awake now, their thin frames propped up against the pillows. The boy, Cody, as Ivan would soon learn, looked up first, his dark eyes wary but curious. The girl, Athena, clung to a small stuffed animal one of the nurses must have given her, her gaze flicking to Ivan briefly before dropping to her lap. "Hey there," Ivan said gently, stepping inside and pulling a chair closer to their beds. "How are you two holding up?" The boy didn't answer right away, his gaze darting toward his sister before settling back on Ivan. "We're okay," he said finally, his voice quiet and hoarse. Ivan nodded, his expression softening. "Good. You gave us all quite a scare out there. But you're safe now. That's what matters." For a while, the room was silent except for the faint beeping of the monitors. Ivan didn't push them to speak, letting them set the pace. Eventually, it was Cody who broke the silence. "My name's Cody," he said, his voice steadier now. "This is Athena. She's my little sister." Ivan smiled faintly. "Well, it's good to meet you both. I'm Ivan." Athena looked up then, her small voice breaking in. "Are you the one who found us?" "That's right," Ivan said. "Me and my crew. We pulled you out of that." "Well, out of where you were." The boy's face darkened slightly, his jaw tightening. "The coffin," he said, the word heavy with meaning. "We were in the coffin." Ivan nodded slowly. "You mind telling me how you ended up in there?" "Take your time." The siblings exchanged a glance, a silent conversation passing between them. Finally, Cody spoke, his words careful and deliberate. "Our parents. They left us," he said, his voice trembling slightly but growing steadier with each word. "They took us to this island, said it was just for a little while. But then they didn't come back." Ivan's stomach tightened, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. He forced himself to stay calm, for the kids' sake. "Why would they do that?" he asked gently. They were fighting," Cody continued, his gaze dropping to his lap. "About money. A lot of money. They thought we'd take it from them someday. So they said we had to go." The girl let out a soft whimper, and Cody reached over to squeeze her hand. Ivan felt a flash of anger, hot and sharp, at the thought of parents abandoning their own children over greed. He swallowed it down, focusing on the boy's words. "We waited," Cody said, "for days. No food, no water. We thought we were going to die. But then we found the coffin. It was just sitting there in the rocks. Empty. We didn't know what else to do, so we climbed in. Figured. Maybe it'd take us somewhere." Ivan's breath hitched. The image of those two kids, starving and desperate, climbing into that coffin with nothing but hope. It was almost too much to bear. He leaned forward, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "And it did take you somewhere. It brought you to us, and I promise you, we're going to make sure you're okay, both of you." The boy nodded, his eyes damp but determined. The girl clutched her stuffed animal tighter, leaning into her brother. Ivan sat back, the weight of their story settling over him like a storm cloud. Later, in the hallway, Ivan spoke with the doctor. The children were malnourished, but recovering, though the emotional scars would take much longer to heal. The doctor mentioned social services, but Ivan shook his head. "I don't want them going back to those parents," he said, his voice firm. "Not after what they've been through." The doctor sighed. "That's not your call to make, Mr. Ivan. But if you're serious about helping them, you might consider fostering or even adopting. The words hung in the air long after the doctor left. Ivan leaned against the wall, staring out the window at the parking lot below. He'd come here looking for answers, but now he had even more questions and a decision to make. One thing was certain, though. He couldn't let those kids go back to the people who'd hurt them. By the next morning, Ivan was seated in the cramped office of a social services worker, a woman named Ms. Bailey. Her desk was cluttered with files and paperwork, the room smelling faintly of stale coffee and pencil shavings. She adjusted her glasses and flipped through the forms Ivan had filled out. "You've got a lot of questions here, Mr. Ivan," she said, her tone kind but firm. "But I'll be honest with you, it's not going to be easy. The legal process, the hearings, it all takes time. And then there's the matter of their parents." Ivan leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly. "What about their parents?" Miss Bailey set the papers down, folding her hands on the desk. "They're being investigated as we speak. If what the children said checks out, and I don't doubt it does, this will likely go to court. But until a ruling is made, there's always a risk they could try to regain custody." A flash of anger coursed through him. After what they did, they shouldn't even be allowed near those kids. "I understand your frustration," she said gently. "But the law requires due process. It's my job to make sure those children are safe in the meantime. That's why we're proceeding with care." Ivan nodded, though the answer didn't satisfy him. He knew she was right. But the thought of Cody and Athena being anywhere near those people again made his stomach turn. The investigation moved quickly, spurred by the gravity of the accusations. Ivan gave his statement to the authorities, recounting what the children had told him and his crew. The officers' faces hardened as he spoke, their pens moving swiftly across their notepads. It wasn't long before the children's parents were located and brought in for questioning. The mother, thin and sharp-eyed, denied everything, while the father, a gruff, unshaven man, was less composed, his answers filled with contradictions. Both claimed innocence, insisting the children had wandered off on their own. Ivan attended the court hearing a few weeks later, sitting in the back row of the small wood-paneled courtroom. Cody and Athena weren't present, thankfully spared the ordeal, but their absence didn't make the proceedings any less tense. Ivan felt every word like a weight on his chest as the prosecution laid out the case against the parents. Abandonment, neglect, and emotional abuse. When it was Ivan's turn to testify, he stood with a steady resolve, his voice clear and unwavering. He described finding the children, their condition, and the story they had shared with him. He spoke of their desperation, their courage, and their innocence, and he didn't hold back when it came to his opinion of the parents. "These kids didn't deserve what happened to them," he said, his gaze hard as it met the judge's. "And they sure as hell don't deserve to be sent back to the people who left them to die." His words hung in the air, the courtroom silent except for the faint rustling of papers. The parents glared at him from their seats, but Ivan didn't flinch. He wasn't afraid of them, not anymore. The ruling came down 2 days later. The parents were found guilty of neglect and abandonment, their custody rights permanently revoked. Their assets were frozen, with a portion allocated to a trust for the children, to be accessed when they turned 18. When Ivan heard the news, he felt a wave of relief, but it was tempered by the reality of what came next. The children were free from their parents, but they still needed a home. Ivan didn't hesitate. He met with Miss Bailey that afternoon, his mind made up. "I want to take them in," he said. "Whatever it takes, I'll do it." Miss Bailey studied him for a moment, then smiled. "You're a good man, Mr. Ivan." Ivan sat at the kitchen table that evening, the light from the old lamp casting a soft glow over the worn wood. His eldest, Anna, sat across from him, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. The twins, Jacob and Paul, leaned against the counter, their arms folded, mirroring each other in that way siblings often do. The youngest, Sarah, sat quietly at the far end of the table, her eyes flicking between her father and her siblings. "I won't lie to you," Ivan began, his voice steady but subdued. "Taking in these kids, it's not going to be easy. They've been through things most grown folks wouldn't survive, and they'll need time, patience, and a lot of love." The room was silent except for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Ivan's kids were grown, with lives of their own, but they still looked to him in moments like these, weighing his words as if they carried the weight of the world. And maybe, in a way, they did. "What do you think, Dad?" Anna finally asked, her voice gentle but direct. "About all this?" Ivan leaned back in his chair, his fingers brushing the edge of the table. "I think," he said slowly, "those kids deserve a shot at something better. I think they've had enough hurt for a lifetime, and if I can give them a home where they feel safe, where they feel wanted, I want to do that." Anna nodded, her expression thoughtful. Jacob and Paul exchanged a glance, the unspoken conversation between them clear even in silence. Sarah, quiet as ever, spoke up, her voice soft but firm. "Then we should do it," she said. "If you think it's right, Dad, we'll support you." The twins chimed in next, their voices overlapping in agreement. Anna smiled faintly, leaning forward to place her hand over Ivan's. "We're with you, Dad," she said. "All the way." The next few weeks passed in a blur of paperwork, meetings, and home visits. Ivan threw himself into the process, determined to make everything perfect for Cody and Athena. He worked with Ms. Bailey to navigate the legal hurdles, attending every meeting and signing every form with a quiet resolve that left no room for doubt. He made space in the house, clearing out the spare room that had once been used for storage. The old bed frame was repaired, new sheets were bought, and the walls were painted a soft, welcoming blue. It was a small room, but Ivan filled it with warmth, adding little touches he thought might make the kids feel more at home. A bookshelf stocked with stories of adventure, a soft lamp for reading, and a pair of blankets he'd found at the market, one in deep green and the other in a cheerful yellow. The day finally came when the paperwork was complete and the adoption was finalized. Ivan walked out of the courthouse with a strange mix of emotions swirling inside him. Relief, joy, and a nervous energy that made his hands tremble slightly as he reached for the truck keys. When he arrived to pick up Cody and Athena, they were waiting for him in the small common room of the foster center. Athena was clutching her stuffed animal tightly, her feet swinging nervously over the edge of the chair. Cody stood beside her, his expression guarded but hopeful. "Ready to go home?" Ivan asked, his voice warm. Athena nodded, her small smile breaking through her shyness. Cody glanced at her, then back at Ivan, his own smile hesitant but genuine. "Yeah," he said. "We're ready." The drive home was quiet but comfortable. Ivan spoke gently, telling them about the house, the room he'd set up for them, and the little town they'd be living in. Athena listened intently, her eyes wide with curiosity, while Cody asked the occasional question, his voice steady but tinged with the uncertainty of someone still learning to trust. When they arrived, Ivan led them inside, watching as they took in their new surroundings. The room he'd prepared was the last stop, and when he opened the door, Athena's eyes lit up. "This is for us?" she asked, her voice filled with wonder. Ivan nodded, his chest tightening at the sight of her smile. "It's all yours," he said. "I hope it feels like home." Cody stepped inside, running his hand along the edge of the bookshelf before turning to Ivan. "It's perfect," he said quietly. "Thank you." Ivan sat at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. From the living room, the sound of laughter carried through the house, light and carefree. It wasn't the kind of noise he was used to. Before, the house had been too quiet, filled with the kind of silence that seemed to echo the distance between its occupants. But now, the walls felt alive, humming with energy he hadn't realized he'd been missing. Cody and Athena had settled into their new home faster than Ivan could have hoped. Cody, ever the protector, had taken to helping with chores around the house, his focus and diligence a quiet reflection of his gratitude. Athena, meanwhile, had quickly become the heart of the household. Her giggles were infectious, her curiosity boundless. Even Ivan's grown children, who came by often, seemed to have softened in her presence, their teasing and playful banter creating a warmth that lingered long after they left. One afternoon, as Ivan cleaned out the shed, he heard footsteps crunching on the gravel behind him. Turning, he found Cody standing there, hands in his pockets, his expression thoughtful. "Need a hand?" Cody asked. Ivan nodded, stepping aside. "Sure could use one. Got a few things that need sorting if you're up for it." Cody joined him, rolling up his sleeves without hesitation. They worked side by side in companionable silence for a while, the rhythm of their movements easing the weight of unspoken words. It was Cody who broke the silence first. "Do you think things will always be like this?" he asked, his voice tentative. Ivan paused, leaning against the workbench. "Like what?" "Good," Cody said, his gaze dropping to the floor. "Safe." Ivan considered his words carefully, recognizing the vulnerability behind the question. "I hope so," he said honestly. "And I'll do everything I can to make sure it stays that way. You and Athena deserve that." Cody looked up, his eyes meeting Ivan's. There was a flicker of something there. Hope, maybe, or trust. It was fleeting, but it was enough. That evening the family gathered for dinner, a tradition Ivan had insisted on reinstating. The table was crowded but cozy, the air filled with the aroma of baked chicken and fresh bread. Athena sat beside Sarah, who was teaching her how to braid her hair. Across the table, Cody and Jacob argued good-naturedly about the best way to fix a broken bike chain. Ivan watched it all unfold with a quiet sense of pride. This was what he'd wanted, a home filled with life, where no one felt out of place or unwanted. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, and that made all the difference. After dinner, as the younger ones cleared the table, Anna stayed behind, sitting with Ivan on the porch. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of gold and pink. Anna sipped her tea, her expression thoughtful. "You've changed, Dad," she said, breaking the comfortable silence. Ivan raised an eyebrow. "That so?" She nodded. "You're different. Happier, I think. More present." He didn't respond right away, letting her words sink in. "Finally," he said, "I think I needed this as much as they did. Maybe more. It's easy to lose sight of what matters when you're always chasing something else." Anna smiled, reaching over to squeeze his hand. "Well, whatever it is, it suits you." In the weeks that followed, Ivan found himself learning things he hadn't expected. He learned how to fix Athena's favorite doll when it lost an arm, how to help Cody with his math homework, even when the numbers didn't seem to make sense. He learned that family wasn't just about blood. It was about showing up, about being there when it mattered most. But he also learned that healing wasn't a straight path. There were nights when Athena woke up crying, her small frame trembling as Ivan sat by her bed, holding her hand until she drifted back to sleep. There were days when Cody grew quiet and withdrawn, his mind clearly elsewhere. Ivan didn't push them to talk, letting them come to him when they were ready. And when they did, he listened, offering nothing but his presence and his promise that they were safe now. One crisp autumn morning, the family piled into the truck and drove to a nearby park. The air was cool, the trees bursting with shades of red and orange. Ivan watched as Athena raced ahead with Sarah, their laughter ringing out like a melody. Cody walked beside Ivan, his step steady, his expression calm. "Thanks for this," Cody said quietly. "For what?" Ivan asked. "For everything," the boy replied. "For giving us a chance." Ivan stopped walking, turning to face him. "You don't owe me thanks for that," he said firmly. "Family looks out for each other. That's just how it is." Cody nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make Ivan's chest swell with something he hadn't felt in a long time: contentment. That night, as the house settled into its usual quiet rhythm, Ivan sat by the fireplace, the flickering flames casting shadows on the walls. Athena was curled up beside him, her head resting against his arm, while Cody sat on the floor, flipping through an old photo album Anna had brought over. Ivan's gaze drifted to the photos, each one a snapshot of a life that felt distant now. There were pictures of fishing trips, birthdays, and family gatherings, moments frozen in time. But as he looked around the room at the faces of his new family, he realized something important. The past was part of him, but it didn't define him. What mattered was here and now, the laughter, the warmth, the love that filled the spaces once left empty. And for the first time in years, Ivan felt whole. The story of Ivan is a deeply moving tale of resilience, redemption, and the enduring power of love and family. Ivan's journey, from a hard-working fisherman burdened by guilt and estranged relationships, to a compassionate father who rebuilds his life around new responsibilities, is profoundly inspiring. His character reflects quiet strength, facing betrayal, loss, and the overwhelming mystery of the children with remarkable dignity and determination. The bond he forms with Cody and Athena, two vulnerable souls abandoned by their parents, exemplifies the transformative power of empathy and selflessness. Ivan doesn't merely save their lives, he offers them a home and, more importantly, a sense of belonging and security. Through his actions, the story underscores the idea that family is not defined by blood, but by love, trust, and the willingness to stand by one another through trials. A powerful lesson emerges from Ivan's journey. Life's greatest meaning often lies in acts of kindness and the relationships we nurture. Despite personal pain and adversity, Ivan shows us that healing is possible when we focus on what truly matters, being there for others. His story is a poignant reminder that hope and humanity can triumph over even the harshest circumstances. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and share it. Leave a comment to tell us how it inspired you, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. May God bless you and be with you every step of the way.